The smell hit me first. Not the good smell of my backyard, the damp earth, the sharp scent of tomato leaves warming in the sun, the memory of Eleanor's roses that still clung to the soil after all these years. No, this was a dead smell. The chemical bite of curing concrete. I stood on the threshold of my own back door, my overnight bag still in my hand. Michael had dropped me off just moments before, a quick, distracted pat on my shoulder before he sped away, already late for some meeting his wife Susan had put in his calendar. "Get settled in, Dad," he'd said. "We'll be over for the barbecue Sunday. You're going to love it." I didn't understand. A barbecue. We had barbecues all the time. I had the old charcoal grill, rusted but faithful, that had cooked more burgers and ribs than Michael had years on this earth. I pushed the screen door open. The spring groaned its familiar complaint. And I saw it. My garden was gone. Every last inch of it. The raised beds I'd built with my own hands 30 years ago gone. The patch where Eleanor's prize-winning roses had bloomed, a riot of crimson and pale pink gone. The corner where my father taught me to grow collards, the same patch where I taught Michael gone. All of it, buried. In its place was a sea of pale, sterile gray. A concrete patio, perfectly flat, perfectly clean, stretching from the back door to the far fence line. It was enormous, offensive in its bland perfection. In the corner, where my compost heap used to be, sat a monstrous, gleaming stainless steel grill. It had 6 burners and a side tray and more knobs than the cockpit of an airplane. It looked like something that belonged in a magazine, not in the humble backyard of a man who understood the sacred power of charcoal and patience. My bag slipped from my fingers. It landed softly on the linoleum of my kitchen floor. I didn't hear it. The only sound was a roaring in my ears, a white noise that drowned out the chirping of the sparrows who used to feast on the worms in my tilled earth. There was no earth now. I walked out onto the slab. My old leather work boots, the soles caked with the soil of a lifetime, felt alien on the smooth, unyielding surface. It was like walking on the moon. Cold. Lifeless. I knelt down, my old knees protesting. I laid my palm flat against the concrete. It was still warm from the afternoon sun, but it was a dead warmth. It had no life in it. It gave nothing back. I thought of the phone call from Susan 2 weeks ago. "Arthur," she'd said, her voice bright and brittle, the way it always was when she was about to manage me. "We've booked a little getaway for you, just for the weekend. A nice motel out by the lake. A little respite." I didn't need a respite. My home was my respite. My garden was my sanctuary. But I knew better than to argue. Arguing with Susan was like trying to punch water. You just got tired and wet. "We have a surprise for you when you get back," she'd chirped. "Something to make your life easier." Easier. They had decided my life was too hard. My life of dirt under my fingernails, of checking the weather, of coaxing life from the stubborn clay soil of this city. They thought bending and weeding and watering was a burden. I didn't understand. It was the only thing holding me upright. Each tomato plant was a memory of my father, showing me how to stake the vines. Each rose bush was a conversation with Eleanor, her laughter echoing as she snipped a perfect bloom for the vase on our kitchen table. The herbs were for the community, for the neighbors who knew my door was always open if they needed a sprig of rosemary for their chicken or a bit of mint for their tea. They hadn't just paved over a garden. They had paved over my life. They had entombed my memories. My hand on the concrete began to tremble. Not with rage. Not yet. It was a deeper, colder tremor. A tectonic shift deep inside me. The ground of my world, the very foundation of my patience and my quiet endurance, had just cracked open. I pushed myself back to my feet. I walked over to the monstrous grill. A plastic cover was draped over it. I lifted a corner. It was pristine, untouched. A price tag was still dangling from one of the knobs. The price made my breath catch in my throat. It was more than my first car cost. This was their gift. This was their idea of love. Replacing something that was alive with something that was expensive. I let the cover drop. I turned and walked back into my silent house. I picked up my bag. I unpacked my things with a slow, deliberate calm that felt entirely new to me. I put my worn copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X back on my nightstand. I hung my good church jacket in the closet. I did not look out the back window again. I did not need to. The image was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. A flat, gray wasteland, a monument to their profound and complete misunderstanding of who I was. For 50 years, I had been a father, a husband, a neighbor, a man of the church, a man who could fix anything that was broken. But in their eyes, I had become a problem to be managed, a life to be made easier. The trembling in my hands stopped. A strange stillness settled over me. It was not peace. It was something else. Clarity. That night, sleep did not come. I sat in my armchair, the leather worn smooth by the years, the imprint of my body a permanent part of its shape. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The familiar nighttime sounds were different now. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, more mechanical. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out the rhythms of my life with Eleanor, now sounded like a countdown. I did not turn on the television. I did not put a record on the turntable. No B.B. King. No Yon Coltrane. The blues felt too loud for the moment, too full of a pain that had a voice. My pain was silent. It was a vacuum. I got up and went to the kitchen. I performed the ritual. The scoop of dark roast coffee beans into the grinder. The whirring sound that for decades had been the signal of a new day beginning. The smell of the grounds, rich and promising. The slow pour of hot water over the filter. I made a full pot just as I always did, but I only poured 1 cup. Black. No sugar. I carried the steaming mug back to my chair. The warmth seeped in my hands, but couldn't reach the coldness that had settled deep in my bones. I stared at the dark liquid. My son, Michael. I remembered him as a boy, his hands covered in mud, a triumphant grin on his face as he held up a lumpy, misshapen carrot he had pulled from the earth himself. "I grew it, Daddy," he had shouted. "I grew it all by myself." Where did that boy go? When did the man who replaced him decide that dirt was a problem? That growing things was a chore for an old man who couldn't handle it anymore. He and Susan had been dropping hints for months. "Dad, you shouldn't be out there in the heat all day, Dad. What if you fall?" "No one would know. We found this wonderful service, Dad. They do lawn care and landscaping. It's very reasonable." I had ignored them. I had smiled and nodded and gone right on tending my garden. I thought it was my right. My home. My land. A small patch of earth that was mine to command. I was wrong. In their eyes, it was just property, an asset, and I was just the caretaker, a temporary tenant in my own life, until they decided on a more efficient management plan. The coffee was bitter on my tongue. I thought about the word they used. Respite. They sent me away so they could do this without having to look me in the eye. They knew I would have said no. They knew I would have fought them. So they removed me from the equation. They treated me like a child being sent to his room while the adults made decisions. The clarity I had felt earlier began to sharpen. It honed itself into a fine, hard point. It was not anger. Anger is a hot, messy thing. This was cold. It was precise. It was a decision taking root in the barren soil of my disappointment. I drank the last of the coffee. I rinsed the mug and placed it carefully in the dish drainer. I walked over to the small roll-top desk in the corner of the living room, the one that had been my father's. I hadn't opened it in years. I rolled back the wooden cover. Dust motes danced in the dim light from the street lamp outside my window. Inside were old bills paid long ago, dried-up pens, photographs of people whose names I could no longer recall. In the back, I found what I was looking for. A box of heavy, cream-colored stationery, left over from the thank-you notes Eleanor and I had sent after our wedding. It was still good. I took out a single sheet. I found my father's old fountain pen. The ink cartridge was dry, of course. I searched the drawers and found a bottle of black ink, still liquid. I carefully filled the pen, my hands steady. The mechanics of it were familiar, comforting. A simple, solvable problem. I sat there for a long time, the pen in my hand, the blank sheet of paper before me. The grandfather clock chimed 2, then 3. Finally, I uncapped the pen. The nib scratched against the thick paper, a sound of permanence. In my best cursive, a skill I learned in a classroom that no longer exists, I wrote a single sentence in the center of the page. A man's garden is his own ground. I looked at the words. They seemed absolute, a declaration of a truth I had forgotten I was allowed to own. I capped the pen. I left the paper on the desk. I went to bed, and for the first time since I come home to my concrete yard, I slept. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house was still steeped in shadow. The piece of paper was still on the desk, the ink dry, the statement settled. I did not put on my work clothes. I did not reach for my worn jeans or my flannel shirt. Instead, I opened the closet and took out my Sunday suit. The dark gray one. The one I wore to church, to funerals, to baptisms. The one Eleanor had always said made me look distinguished. I shaved with my straight razor, taking my time, the scrape of the blade a meditative sound. I polished my good leather shoes until I could see my own tired face reflected in them. I put on a white shirt, a starched collar, a simple dark tie. Dressed, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Or perhaps I was finally becoming myself again. I didn't make coffee. I wasn't in the mood for rituals this morning. This was a day for breaking them. I walked out my front door and locked it behind me. I did not take my car. The old Ford sedan sat silent in the driveway. I needed to walk. I needed to feel the pavement under my polished shoes. I needed the city to wake up around me. My destination was a small, two-story brick building on a side street downtown. I passed it 1,000 times over the years. A simple brass plate next to the door read, Davis & Associates, Attorneys at Law. I had never had a reason to go inside. Until today. The office was quiet when I entered. A young woman at the front desk looked up, her expression politely questioning. I need to see a lawyer, I said. My voice sounded steady, firmer than I felt. Do you have an appointment? No, I said, but it's important. Maybe it was the suit. Maybe it was the look in my eye. She hesitated, then picked up her phone. After a quiet murmur, she nodded. Ms. Davis can see you for a few minutes. Ms. Davis was not what I expected. She was young, maybe 35. A black woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense handshake. Her office was neat, organized, smelling of paper and faint perfume. Mr. She began, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. Washington, I said, sitting down. Arthur Washington. What can I do for you, Mr. Washington? I took a breath. I told her everything. I didn't rush. I started with the garden, with Eleanor's roses. I told her about the respite weekend. I described the concrete, the soulless gray slab that had replaced my life's work. I told her about the power of attorney documents my son Michael had me sign a few years ago after I had a small health scare. He'd said it was just in case of formality, to make things easier. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition. Understanding. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, her pen poised over a yellow legal pad, though she didn't write a single word. She let me speak until the whole sorry story was laid out on the polished surface of her desk between us. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. Mr. Washington, she said finally, her voice calm and even. What is it you want to do? I want it back, I said. The garden? She asked gently. No, I said. That's gone. I want my life back. I want control. I want my name to be my own again. She finally wrote something on her pad. A single line. She underlined it twice. We can start immediately, she said. The first step is to revoke the existing power of attorney. We will draft a new document that names an executor of your own choosing. Someone you trust. I thought for a moment. Trust. It was a word that had been hollowed out. I trust myself, I said. She nodded, a small, approving smile on her lips. Of course. We can also draft a new will and set up clear directives for your medical and financial affairs, all under your sole authority. Good, I said. The word felt solid in my mouth. The second thing, she continued, leaning forward, concerns your bank accounts. Are they jointly held with your son? Yes, I admitted. For convenience. In case of an emergency. We need to change that. Once the power of attorney is revoked, you can go to your bank and establish new accounts in your name only. You are legally entitled to withdraw your funds and move them. I'll have the revocation paperwork messengered to your son and his wife this afternoon. The thought of their faces when that envelope arrived gave me a grim, quiet satisfaction. I left her office an hour later with a file of papers and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The sun was higher in the sky now. The city was bustling. For the first time, I didn't feel like an old man shuffling through a world that had forgotten him. I felt like Arthur Washington, a man with a lawyer, a man taking his ground back. My next stop was the bank. The branch manager, a man named Mr. Harris, knew me. He'd handled my mortgage papers when Eleanor and I first bought the house. He was younger then. We both were. He greeted me with a warm smile, but his eyes clouded with concern when I laid the freshly inked legal document from Ms. Davis on his desk. "Arthur," he said, his voice low, "is everything all right?" "Everything is getting right, Bill," I said. "I need to open a new checking and savings account, in my name only, and I need to transfer the entire balance from my old accounts into the new ones." He read the revocation notice. He didn't ask questions. He was a professional. He saw the signature, the notary's stamp. He nodded. The process took less than 30 minutes. A few signatures, a new debit card, a new checkbook. When it was done, he handed me a receipt for the transfer. It was a simple slip of paper, but it felt as heavy and significant as a deed. I stood up and shook his hand. "Thank you, Bill. You take care of yourself, Arthur," he said, his eyes full of a kindness I suddenly realized I had been starved for. Walking home, the sun on my back, I felt a lightness in my step. The suit felt less like a costume and more like armor. I had severed the first tie, the invisible cords of financial dependence and assumed authority that Michael and Susan had wrapped around me were beginning to fray. When I got home, the house felt different. It was still my house, but the terms of my ownership had changed. I was no longer just living here. I was in command. I went to the living room wall, where a collection of framed photographs hung. Recent ones, the grandkids' school pictures, a forced family portrait from last Christmas, everyone in matching red sweaters. Michael and Susan at some fancy resort, their smiles wide and artificial. I took them down one by one. I didn't break the glass. I didn't tear the photos. I carefully removed them from their frames, stacked them neatly, and found an old shoebox. I placed the stack of glossy, smiling strangers inside the box. I took the box to the attic and put it in a dark corner, out of sight. Then I went to my workshop. The workshop was my other sanctuary. The smell of sawdust and motor oil was as comforting to me as the smell of soil. My tools hung in their proper places, each one a friend, each one holding the memory of 100 repairs, 1,000 projects. In the corner stood a small, sturdy workbench. I had built it for my grandson, Jacob, for his 8th birthday. I had imagined teaching him how to use a hammer or a saw. I imagined passing down my knowledge, my love for making things with my own hands. He had used it once. He'd hammered a few nails into a block of wood, gotten bored, and gone inside to play a video game. The workbench had sat there for 5 years, collecting dust, a monument to a future that never arrived. I picked up a hammer. I began to dismantle it. Not with anger, with precision. I carefully pried the nails out. I separated the pieces of lumber I had so carefully cut and sanded. I stacked the wood neatly against the wall. It was no longer a workbench for a boy who didn't want it. It was just wood again, raw material, full of potential for something new, something for me. As I worked, the sun streamed through the dusty window of the garage. I could hear the sounds of the neighborhood, a dog barking, children laughing, the distant siren. My world was still here. I had just been listening to the wrong voices. I was sweeping up the last of the sawdust when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. A text from Michael. "Dad, try to pay for gas," and the card was declined. "What's going on?" I looked at the message. I felt a flicker of the old obligation, the habit of a father who fixes things for his son. Then I thought of the gray concrete. I deleted the message. I did not reply. The silence was my answer. The call started an hour later. First Michael. I let go to voicemail. The message was clipped, annoyed. "Dad, call me. The bank said the account was closed. What did you do? This is a mess." Then Susan. Her voice was syrupy sweet, laced with steel. "Arthur, honey, we're a little confused over here. There must be some mistake with the bank. We're worried something's happened. Please call us back as soon as you get this." Worried. They were worried about the money, not about me. If they were worried about me, They would have asked before they buried my garden under a ton of rock and sand. I listened to each message. Then I deleted them, one by one. It was a cleansing act, wiping the slate clean. The next day, a thick envelope arrived for me. It was from Ms. Davis's office. Inside were copies of the revocation notice and a letter confirming it had been delivered to Michael and Susan's address. It was official. I was a free agent. The phone buzzed and rang all day. The texts became more frantic. The voicemails shifted from annoyance to outright accusation. "Dad, what the hell is this legal letter? Are you losing your mind?" Michael's voice was tight with fury. "Susan is in tears. After all we've done for you. After we spent a fortune on that new patio to make the backyard safe for you." Safe. He used the word safe. I almost laughed. They had made my world safe by killing everything in it that I loved. Susan left another message. This one had no honey in it, just venom. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Arthur, but it's cruel and childish. We were just trying to help you, to give you a beautiful, low-maintenance space. You're being incredibly ungrateful. You're punishing us, and for what? For what?" The question hung in the silence of my living room. She truly did not know. They had no capacity to understand what they had taken from me. Their world was one of surfaces, of convenience, of appearances. My world was one of roots, of history, of connection to the earth. We were speaking different languages. And I was done trying to be a translator. I blocked their numbers. Michael's, Susan's. The house fell into a profound and blessed silence. It was the first time in years my phone hadn't been a tether to their demands, their schedules, their manufactured crises. The silence was a space I could finally breathe in. For a week, I lived in that quiet. I worked in my shop. I read my books. I sat on my front porch and watched the world go by. I did not go in the backyard. I refused to give the concrete my attention. It was a dead thing, and I was choosing life. But I felt a pull, an ache in my hands for the feel of soil, an emptiness where the rhythm of watering and weeding used to be. I was free, but I was unmoored. One afternoon, I went for a walk. I didn't have a destination. I just let my feet carry me through the old neighborhood, past the barber shop where I used to get my hair cut, where the old men still play dominoes and solve the world's problems, past the church where Eleanor and I were married. I turned a corner onto a street I hadn't been down a while, and I saw it. An explosion of green in a place where there used to be nothing but broken glass and weeds. It was a vacant lot that had been an eyesore for as long as I could remember. Now it was a thriving, bustling farm. Rows of collards and kale stood at attention. Tomato vines, heavy with green fruit, climbed up intricate trellises. Bright orange marigolds stood guard at the edges of the beds, their peppery scent filling the air. There were people working, their heads bent in concentration, their hands in the dirt. Young people, mostly, laughing and talking as they worked. A simple, hand-painted sign was staked into the ground near the sidewalk. It read, "Green Shoots Community Project." I stood and watched for a long time. It was beautiful. It was life, stubborn and insistent, pushing its way up through the cracks of the city. It was everything my backyard used to be and more. A young woman with her hair in long, beautiful braids looked up and saw me watching. She smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She wiped a hand on her jeans, leaving a streak of dirt, and walked over. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was warm. "No," I said, "just admiring. You've done good work here." "Thank you," she said, her smile widening. "It's a lot of work, but it's good work. I'm Imani." She held out her dirt-streaked hand. I took it. Her grip was firm. "Arthur Washington. You a gardener, Arthur?" she asked, looking at my hands. They were clean now, but the calluses were still there. The ingrained lines of soil were a map of my life that no amount of soap could ever wash away. "I used to be," I said. The words came out quieter than I intended. "Once a gardener, always a gardener," she said with a laugh. "It gets in your blood." We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, just looking at the garden. "That's some good-looking soil you got there," I observed, pointing to the rich, dark earth in the beds. "You didn't start with that. The soil around here is mostly clay." Her eyes lit up. You know your stuff. No, we trucked in tons of compost. Took us almost a year to build up the beds. Compost is the key, I nodded. The secret to everything. We talked for nearly an hour. About tomato blight, about the best way to keep aphids off the kale, about the simple joy of eating something you grew with your own hands. She didn't treat me like an old man. She treated me like an equal, a fellow soldier in the war against concrete. As I was leaving, she said, "You should come by again, Arthur. Volunteer if you've got the time. We can always use another pair of knowledgeable hands." The invitation settled in my chest, a warm and welcome weight. "I might just do that," I said. Walking home, a new idea began to form in my mind. It was a radical idea, a wild idea. It was an idea that made me feel a thrill of something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Fear, mixed with a dizzying sense of possibility. The house had been my anchor for 50 years. It was my castle, my fortress. It was also, I realized, my prison. It was the asset my son and his wife were waiting for. The prize at the end of the game. What if I changed the rules of the game? What if the house wasn't the end of my story? What if it was the beginning of a new one? The next morning, I called Ms. Davis. "I need to see you again," I said. "I want to make a change to my will. A big one each." When I sat in her office that afternoon, I laid out my plan. I spoke without hesitation, the idea, now fully formed, solid and clear in my mind. "I want to leave my house to the Green Shoots Community Project," I said. Ms. Davis blinked. It was the first time I had ever seen her surprised. The whole property, I confirmed. The house, the land, everything. I want them to have it, to turn it into something that grows, to feed people, to teach children where food comes from. She was silent for a long moment, studying my face. "Mr. Washington," she said carefully, "this is a very significant decision. Your house is your primary asset. Are you certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I said. "But there's a condition." "Go on." "I want to live there for the rest of my days. A life estate. I want the deed transferred now, but my right to live in my home remains until I die. Can that be done?" She nodded slowly. "Yes. A life estate is a standard legal instrument. It's perfectly doable. We would be deeding the property to the nonprofit with a retained life interest for you." "And my son?" I asked. "Can he challenge it?" "He can try," she said, a flicker of the fighter I'd first seen in her eyes returning. "But if we do this correctly, with a certificate of mental competency from a doctor and clear, unambiguous language in the deed transfer in your will, it will be very, very difficult for him to overturn. Your mind is your own, Mr. Washington. Your property is your own. You can do with it as you see fit. My property is my own." The words echoed the sentence I had written on that first lonely night. A man's garden is his own ground. "Let's do it," I said. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. I met with Imani and the board of her small nonprofit. When I told them my plan, they were stunned into silence. Imani had tears in her eyes. "Arthur, we can't accept this," she stammered. "It's too much." "It's not too much," I said firmly. "It's the right thing. My house needs life in it again. It needs a purpose. You can give it one. All I ask is that you let an old man live out his days on the porch, and that you promise me one thing." "Anything," she whispered. "That ugly slab of concrete in my backyard," I said. "I want you to break it up. I want you to bring the dirt back." A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "Consider done," she said. "We'll bring the sledgehammers ourselves." There were doctor's appointments, competency evaluations, and stacks of paperwork to sign. With each signature, I felt lighter. I was giving away the most valuable thing I owned, but I felt like I was gaining the world. I was redirecting my legacy. It would not be a house passed down out of obligation, but a gift given freely, with purpose and with love. My legacy wouldn't be in a bloodline that had forgotten the value of the earth. It would be in the soil itself. The day the final papers were signed and filed with the city, a profound peace settled over me. The house was no longer mine on paper, but in my heart, it had finally, truly become my home again. It was about a week later that they came. I was on my front porch, enjoying the evening air, when a car I didn't recognize pulled up to the curb with a screech of tires. Michael and Susan got out. They looked undone. Michael's face was pale and blotchy with anger. Susan's was a mask of furious disbelief. They marched to my walkway. They didn't knock. Michael tried the door, and when he found it locked, he began to pound on it with his fist. "Dad, open this door. We know you're in there." I didn't move from my rocking chair. I just watched them. "What is the meaning of this, Arthur?" Susan shrieked through the door. "We got a letter from some lawyer. About the house. This is insane." I took a slow sip of my sweet tea. I had waited for this moment. I had rehearsed it in my mind. I had imagined myself yelling, crying, defending. But now that was here, all I felt was a great and powerful calm. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. I did not open it wide. I stood on the threshold, my body blocking the entrance. They fell silent, surprised to see me so close. They looked at me, their faces a mess of conflicting emotions. Anger, confusion, and underneath it all, a sliver of fear. The fear of people who have lost control. "What have you done?" Michael finally choked out, waving a crumpled letter in his hand. "You gave away our house. My inheritance. The house I grew up in." "It was never your house, Michael," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the evening air. "It was my house, and I did with it as I saw fit." "You're senile," Susan accused, her voice rising. "Someone took advantage of you. We're going to fight this. We're going to have you declared incompetent." I looked at her, really looked at her, at the expensive handbag clutched in her white-knuckled grip, the perfectly manicured nails, the expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement on her face. And I felt nothing. Not hatred, not even dislike, just a vast, empty distance. "You paved over my wife's roses," I said, the words simple, factual. "You poured concrete over the garden my father taught me to tend. You did it without asking. You did it while I was gone. Then you bought a shiny new grill and told me it was for my own good." I paused, letting the words hang in the space between us. "You did not see a garden," I continued, my voice as steady as a stone. "You saw a problem to be solved. You did not see a man. You saw a burden to be managed. You didn't want my life to be easier. You wanted it to be more convenient for you." Michael's face crumpled. For a second, he looked like the little boy who had dropped a glass of milk, terrified of the mess he had made. "Dad, we didn't know. We thought." "That's the problem, son," I said, and for the first time, a wave of real sadness washed over me. "You didn't think. You never do. You just do what Susan tells you is best." Susan gasped as if I had slapped her. "The house belongs to the Green Shoots Project now," I said, bringing the conversation to its final point. "They're going to do good things with it. They're going to bring life back to this ground. I will live here in my home until my time is done. That is my right." I looked from my son's broken face to my daughter-in-law's furious one. "You're no longer welcome here," I said. "Not in this house. Not on this land." And then I did the final thing. I closed the door. I did not slam it. I closed it gently, firmly, until I heard the latch click into place. I turned the deadbolt. The sound was a period at the end of a very long sentence. I could hear them shouting outside for a few more minutes. Then, the sound of a car door slamming and the squeal of tires as they sped away. And then, silence. I walked back through my quiet house and out the back door. I stood on the edge of the concrete patio. It was still there, a gray scar on the earth. But now, it looked temporary. It looked weak. I knew its days were numbered. A few days later, they came. Imani and a half-dozen young, strong volunteers from the project. They came with sledgehammers and pickaxes and wheelbarrows. I sat on a kitchen chair I'd brought outside, a safe distance away, with a tall glass of lemonade. Imani stood in the center of the patio, a huge sledgehammer resting on her shoulder. She looked over at me and grinned. "Ready, Arthur?" I nodded. "I've been ready for a long time." She raised the hammer high over her head. For a moment, she was a statue of righteous power against the blue sky. Then she brought it down. The first crack was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A spiderweb of fractures appeared in the smooth gray surface. The volunteers cheered, and then they fell to work, their own hammers rising and falling in a powerful, percussive rhythm. It was the sound of destruction, but it felt like creation. It was the sound of undoing a great wrong. the sound of my garden breathing again. My new life began that day. My home was no longer a quiet, lonely place. It was filled with the energy of the Green Shoots Project. Young people were always coming and going, asking my advice, sharing their lunch with me on the porch, telling me their stories. They broke up every last piece of the concrete. They hauled it away in truckloads. And underneath, wounded but alive, was the soil. Compacted and pale, but it was there. My earth. We spent the rest of the summer nursing it back to health. We tilled in compost and manure. We amended and aerated. I taught them the things my father had taught me, the things I had learned over a lifetime of listening to the land. My hands were in the dirt again. My back ached in the best possible way. We didn't just rebuild my old garden. We planned a new one, a bigger one. The plans were to tear down the old, rotting fence and combine my yard with the empty lot next door, which the project had also acquired. It would be a true community farm, a place of nourishment and connection. My house had become the headquarters. The front bedroom was their office. The kitchen was always full of people washing vegetables for the farm stand they set up on the sidewalk. The sound of laughter echoed in the halls that had been silent for so long. I was no longer Arthur Washington, the old man who lived alone. I was Mr. Arthur, the elder, the resident expert. I had a purpose. I was seen. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, watching the sun set over the newly tilled earth in my backyard, when Imani came and sat beside me. "We got a letter today," she said quietly, "from a lawyer, representing your son." I felt my body tense. "What did it say?" "It was an offer," she said. "He wants to buy the house back from us, for significantly more than it's worth." I looked out at the darkening yard, at the promise of 1,000 green things sleeping in the rich soil. "What did you tell him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I told him this ground was not for sale," she said, "at any price." I nodded. A deep, quiet satisfaction bloomed in my chest, more beautiful than any rose. A few weeks after that, a single envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was addressed to me in Michael's hesitant, almost childish handwriting. I almost threw it away, but curiosity, or maybe the last lingering ember of fatherhood, made me open it. It was a short letter, just a few lines. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about the garden. I'm sorry I didn't listen. I see now that it was more than just a garden. I miss talking to you. Michael." I read the letter 3 times. It was the first time in his adult life he had apologized for anything without making an excuse. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer of my nightstand. I did not answer it. Not yet. An apology was a seed. It was a start, but I had learned that some things, if they are to grow true and strong, need time in the quiet dark. They cannot be rushed. The door to my son was no longer locked and bolted, but it was not wide open either. The price of entry was high. It was the cost of truly seeing, and I would wait and see if he was willing to pay it. That night, I took out my father's old desk supplies. I took out a fresh sheet of that heavy, cream-colored paper. I filled a fountain pen. I sat for a while, thinking. I looked out my window, not at the street, but through the house, toward the backyard. I could almost feel the life stirring in the soil out there. A whole universe of roots and seeds, waiting for the sun. I uncapped the pen. The nib scratched against the paper. "A legacy," I wrote, "is not what you leave behind. It is what you help to grow."